This is Eric Hahn with Offshore Engineer TV, here today with Bill Lewis, Director of Research at Intelatus, to discuss the promising future for floating wind in the U.S. Bill, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here, Eric. Nice to talk about this subject.
Well, to get into it, with the U.S. federal target of 15 gigawatts of floating wind by 2035 and California lease auction supporting over 4.5 gigawatts of floating wind, is now the time to get excited for floating wind in the U.S.?
In short, yes. I mean, the foundations are being put in place by clear federal supports and incentives. But this is a very significant transition, 15 gigawatts, generating lots of opportunity as well as challenges to overcome. Let's just set some context. Global offshore wind installed capacity will reach over 60 gigawatts by the end of 2022. Of this total, less than 500 megawatts, that's 500 megawatts versus 60 gigawatts, that's about 0.2%. Of the capacity is from floating demonstration and pilot projects. That's a very small percentage. Now, the world's largest floating project, the 88 megawatt Hywind Tampen project, is being brought on stream now. So the technology is relatively immature, but we expect floating wind to emerge at scale through the decade, transitioning from pre-commercial projects to large commercial scale floating wind farms. Now, we anticipate around 15 gigawatts of global floating wind installations as being possible by 2030 and up to 60 gigawatts by 2035. And within that, we expect the United States will account for around 20% of the opportunity. So yeah, as I said at the beginning, to answer your question, it's time to be excited.
So you've mentioned some of the challenges, but why is it so challenging given the maturity of the bottom fixed wind farm segment?
I think that's a good question. I mean, the bottom fixed wind segment is a mature industry already, not so much in the United States, but certainly in Western Europe, China, and parts of Asia. But although many elements of the floating wind project is similar to a bottom fixed wind farm, there are many key differences. Now, firstly, it's how the turbine is supported. In a bottom fixed wind farm, the steel monopiles dominate. There are jackets and gravity bases also deployed, but at a high level, the technical solutions are fairly standardized, and the supply chain can build up scale with confidence because they're building the same thing time and time again, and the installation vessels are all geared towards that. But in a floating wind farm, the turbine is supported by a floating structure. Now, broadly speaking, I mean, to those familiar with the oil and gas segment, that would be fairly familiar. There are four major technologies: a semi-submersible, a barge, a TLP, and a spar. And the spar, they divide further into spar buoys and hanging counterweight spars. They're a bit more hybrid than what you see in the oil and gas segment. Now, the common thread of the technologies is that they generally feature physically very large and very heavy structures. But we're tracking over 80 solutions for floating foundations, 80 different solutions to the same problem. Some are concrete, some are steel. Some of the steel structures are suited to large shipyard fabrication, while others are made up from large tubulars that can be produced by wind turbine tower manufacturers. This variety of technical solutions poses some sustainability challenges to the supply chain. There will be concentration, there will be focus, but at the moment, with all the projects that are out there, there are a lot of technologies that are going to be leveraged. Now, the next difference is how these projects are installed. And we're very much focusing on this in Intelatus. Given that the structures float, these need to be secured to the seabed by pre-installed moorings, like you would in a floating oil and gas project or in floating rigs, in floating semis. Mooring solutions split broadly into tension leg moorings fixed with piles or suction anchors, and spread mooring, mainly featuring suction pile or drag embedment anchors. These moorings require the biggest vessels to install them, the biggest anchor handlers. Moorings are pre-installed while the floaters are being manufactured. Floater hulls are mated with turbines alongside or in sheltered water, which limits the amounts of suitable locations where you can do this. Given that the rotor diameter of a single unit is, for a 15 megawatt turbine, is going to be close to 240 meters. Once completed, the turbine mounted on the floater is towed to site, and for hooking up onto pre-installed anchors. But again, these are some very big vessels that are going to be involved in this.
And I've heard people describe the vessels being used to install moorings and tow structures as normal offshore vessels. How do you see it?
Well, yeah, yes and no. Normal in that there are existing vessels from the oil and gas segment. But I'd certainly challenge normal in the terms of the size. As I mentioned, they're big. I mean, if we look at the demonstration projects that have been built today, all have featured the largest anchor handling tugs, AHTSs, and particularly AHTSs because of the large back decks for moorings, and also pretty large AHTSs for towing. And we're talking over 20,000 horsepower. 25,000 horsepower. So there's not a lot of these, and the supply is comparatively small, and it's focused on the traditional oil and gas exploration and production support activities in floating markets in Africa, in certainly in Brazil and in North Europe. High horsepower and large deck requirements are key vessel drivers. From 2026, we're seeing a significant shortage of capable vessels emerging. In the US, there are only 3 large anchor handlers that meet the requirements of projects. When I talk about those US, I'm talking if Jones Act local content requirements come in, which aren't necessarily in place at the moment, but the US is increasing its local content requirements over time. And at the moment, only 3 anchor handlers in the US could work on these type of projects, and really only 1 of them for the moorings. US projects will be competing for overseas supply that is also committed to oil and gas and other floating wind projects. I mean, put simply, we forecast a vessel and, more importantly, actually, a crew shortage past the middle of the decade. We see a need to build more of the right type of vessels and train significant amounts of crew to undertake deep water anchor handling operations.
Rounding off, do you see this opportunity as purely a US West Coast play?
Well, certainly all eyes are focused on the forthcoming 5 California leases. Federal agencies will hold the lease auctions in December of this year for 5 areas. Each on average are on the standard calculation are estimated to have around about 900 megawatts of capacity, although developers will probably get up to a gigawatt or more on that. These will produce the first commercial scale projects in the US. So it is California that's going to lead the way. Now, on commercial scale, but further West Coast commercial scale project activity will come from Oregon and possibly Washington. But let's not forget that currently 2 pre-commercial pilot projects are being advanced in California state waters. And these could deliver power around 26, 27, so long before the commercial California leases. And this will test the supply chain readiness, the ports, the vessels, the whole supply chain. But the first pilot project in the water in the US is expected to be in Maine, so East Coast, not West Coast, and it will be commissioned within the next couple of years. It's very well advanced. This is a precursor to a larger pilot project, and in the longer term, federal leasing of commercial scale projects in Maine. There's also another demonstration project being developed in federal waters of Massachusetts, which should also come on stream around the middle of the decade. So again, long before the commercial projects do off the California side, but this is just testing the technology. Now, recently, BOEM has recommended 8 Central Atlantic wind energy areas to be further refined for federal leasing by around the middle of next year. 3 of the lease areas also contain water depths of over 1,500 meters, all suitable for floating technology. And let's not forget the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, in the short to midterm, all developments will be bottom fixed. Longer term, we anticipate additional leasing in deeper water sites.
All right, great. Well, Bill, thank you very much for your time and your insight.
No, you're welcome. Thanks, Eric.